My name is Roz Cruz, and I am the Associate Curator of Programs here at WICMA. And I'm honored to welcome you here tonight as we gather in this space at Williams College, which we respectfully acknowledge sits on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge Munsee Mohegans, who are the indigenous peoples of the region now called Williamstown. Following tremendous hardship after being forced from their valued homelands, they continue as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, where they reside today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. Come on in, grab a seat. So tonight we're here celebrating the fourth and final program of WICMA's summer series, which is called Construct Your Own Meaning. These events invited community members from near and far, including beer brewers, musicians, young people, and cake artists, to interpret our permanent collection, and specifically the installation called Remixing the Hall. Each participant made a creative response to an artwork on view in the WICMA galleries, and they presented those to the public over the course of the summer, all those different responses, which were beer, public presentation, music, and tonight, cake. So our final event features 4 imaginative cake artists who are sitting in front of you right now, and they're going to tell you a little bit about each of their cakes and how they connect to the artwork that they picked today. And afterwards, we're going to go upstairs to the rotunda, and you're going to get to try each of these cakes. These are the actual cakes that we're going to be looking at in person later this afternoon. So maybe you're wondering why cake? During the second week of quarantine in 2020, my friends canceled a surprise birthday trip they had planned for me, and instead, they dropped off an elegant homemade cake featuring special details like flowers made in buttercream and delicately placed cherries. It was beautiful and also sad, and a moment where we ate the cake at a distance in my backyard. And the cake itself became a symbol for our friendship as the pandemic unfolded, something that sort of kept us together. And this cake, that cake, revived my long interest in the power of sweet treats, which began with my grandfather's bakery and continued throughout my life and continues now through the different creative people that I've known who work in bakeries and express their emotions or holiday themes through baked goods. And with all those people, I've often wondered whether or not they consider themselves artists. I did, of course, always have. And so also during those lockdown days, I was watching a lot of reality TV, specifically baking and cooking shows. And I was also scrolling through Instagram obsessively and noticed a surfacing trend, which was extravagant and strange cakes designed as a way for people to have a special occasion at home when we couldn't really be together. So when things were so isolating, it became really clear to me that a special cake could be a life-affirming kind of event in a way. This is to say that today we're presenting these 4 artists and their work who use their baking skills to bring cheer to people's lives through cake that is actually works of art. And each one has designed a cake for us based on a work of art that they felt drawn to. The artists are, would you wave when I call your name? Alli Gelles of Cakes for Sport, Billy Bello of Cakes for No Occasion, Magnet, and Edward Cabral. I'm going to pose a few questions to them as a starting point for today's conversation, and I'll let them tell you more about who they are as artists and bakers, and we'll have a very brief discussion and leave some time for questions from you all, so be thinking as we're talking. So Alli, I think we'll start with you. Would you please tell us just about the artwork that you selected, how you chose that work of art and how your cake reflects the piece.
Totally. So I chose Louise Nevelson's Skywave. And as I was looking through the collection to select a piece to respond to, I was particularly drawn to this one. It felt so mysterious. It was all black, but at the same time, oddly calming. But it really took some time to consider all of the different components that make up the piece. It feels easy to miss when you first, take a pass at it. And that the whole process of just, going through those different thoughts, really drew me to it. And so that's how I arrived at Louise Nevelson's piece. And then in response to that, I really loved that the piece itself is made of found wood. And so it's so many different shapes and components that she would unify using, the color black. So I really wanted to respond to that in a way of like creating additionally so many different components. So I have my cake itself, and then which is kind of like a traditional, kind of sponge cake, layer cake situation. But then I also wanted to incorporate, some other different kinds of cakes. So we have like cheesecake as well as Decoise.
Thank you, Alli. Billy, would you tell us a bit about your artwork, how you picked it, and how it relates to your cake?
Yes, so I picked this antique egg serving dish. I originally picked it because it looks already like a cake, and as you can see, it is round, and my cakes are also usually round. So I was drawn to it because I thought there was a lot there that I could just go off on. I also use stripes throughout my work, and it has stripes on it, so that was extra bonus for me. And anyways, I loved it. And when I started looking into the piece and learning about its history, it is a import from India made by a British silver smithing company in the 1800s. And Great Britain colonized India and took all the silver back to Great Britain for their own personal use. And I was interested in that because cake for me, I'm Brazilian and my family's from the sugar cane plantation region of Brazil, and the export of sugar, chocolate, coffee, all those things, I think a lot about that in my process and about how we use these things here in America. So there was just a lot of similarities between how these things come to be part of our daily lives. And I wanted to explore that in my piece. And there it is.
Thank you, Billy. Magnet?
Yeah, okay, it's on. Sorry, I was worried about the number thing. Well, I did Allison Janae Hamilton's piece. Alligator Creature. When we first got the list of all the works that were going to be at Williams, I'm pretty sure we all picked the same piece. So we got an email that was like, hey, like, can you pick different pieces? And I actually, I went through and just like looked at each piece, the history of each piece, and tried to pick one that challenged me, but also I felt like I really connected to. And it was Alligator Creature, and I specifically connected with this artist because she is a Black woman from the South, and a lot of her work has to do with swamp creatures, alligators specifically, and kind of posing them as like predator and prey. I feel like we just have very similar experiences in our like artwork. We both really work with plant matter, and I feel like we both work from themes of growing up in the South, food sovereignty, environmental racism, and I don't know, I really felt connected with this piece, and it feels really good to try to like breathe new life into like something that she's already created.
Thank you, Magnet. I also really love swamp creatures as a Floridian myself. So. Edward?
Sure. So I chose a sarcophagus fragment, which I believe is Roman, 3rd century. A lot of my work is very like neoclassical and revival, and so I was really trying to find a piece that could kind of like highlight these like decorative elements and facets that I find really fascinating about sugar, sort of like piggybacking off of what Billy said. A lot of like my practice looking at cake is understanding how like cake and dessert as well as like ornament itself really come from like the sale of bodies and the destruction of 2 different continents that was then emptied out into Europe, you know? And we only have these things because of colonialism. And so like looking at cake as a way to sort of like understand or tear apart or recontextualize like these notions. But then also I had done recently a piece for, my husband is an opera, and I had done masks that were of Dionysus and Apollo. So I was sort of already in this like headspace of like Greek myth and legend. And this fragment comes from the Triumph of Dionysus, which is like a trope, like a theme that happens a lot in ancient art. And it's just like a massive procession. Usually Hercules, who you see here, is like really drunk in these images and is like sort of stumbling over himself, you know. And there's like flower maidens and centaurs and that sort of like over the top exuberance. I really love that sort of like, you know, too much isn't enough kind of thing, you know. And then also too, I love, you know, to sort of challenge myself the idea of like a monochromatic piece. And it also is like a sarcophagus too. The lid is sort of slightly askew, as you can see. And then also too, for the flavors I pulled from like Roman tradition. So I used like a locally sourced wheat, and then I soaked the cake itself in a honey. I used bay leaf and cinnamon, which are very common like dessert spices at the time in the making of this piece. And then the panels themselves are covered in royal icing, which is like a hard icing, like a Christmas cookie is royal icing. And so the idea is when we cut into it, it's going to like sort of fracture and fall apart like the fragment itself. You know, this idea that what we have here is but one piece that will never be complete again. The other pieces are either lost or in other museums or who knows, kind of who cares sort of thing, you know? And so the idea of witnessing that destruction, like sort of from the beginning to the end, is something that it's like a through line of my practice. So I found that a really fun place to start from for this cake.
Thank you. So, you know, I've talked to you a little bit about some of the questions I have for you, but I kind of want to, I'm going to change course, and I have a question based on something Edward just said. You said, like, you think sometimes too much is never enough. I'm wondering if anyone else would like to speak to that, because I think something I like about all of these cakes is there's a lot of things going on, both in the ingredients and in the aesthetic choices. So anyone else want to talk about that, or Edward, do you want to talk more about it?
I can always talk. I mean, yeah, exactly. Well, it's like, we all came up in like the post-1950s world, which is very much like, standardization, modernization, Dutch minimalism, like concrete as a decorative element, wood as a decorative element. And that's all well and good, but that's just not really my vibe. Like, I think, I always imagine, to me, I conceptualize it as, our ancestors grew up in a jungle. And so they were always surrounded by a cacophony of sounds and smells and colors and textures. And as we sort of became more civilized, we ended up in more and more and more houses with like rigid walls and white walls. And so our ornament, I think, in a lot of ways kind of mirrored that. And like the natural state of things is chaos. Like that's the universe, that's the planet, that's everything, right? And so I find a lot of energy and beauty in something that's almost like hard to really look at. Like you really have to sit with it and like piece it apart, and coming from fine art, our eyes have been trained to look at things. And so it's Whereas, like I mentioned, my husband's in music, whereas when he sees something, right, it's almost just like a bunch of noise. Like I automatically will be, oh, that's a person, that's a flower, that's this tree. But when you're not from that place, it really just is this kind of like overwhelming sense, right, of like, what am I even looking at? And that kind of awe, I guess, is something that I'm really attracted to. And also too, ornamentation, I think it's just great. I don't know, it's beautiful. Like, I don't know, everything should be ornamented and decorated and with swags and, that's my opinion, obviously, but as a cake decorator. But yeah, it's just sort of from that place, I think. It's sort of like a post-modern, a pre-modern, modern sort of, what's old is new kind of thing,
Well, for me, I'm mostly interested in like queer opulence in general. I'm really curious about the history of partying, the history of queer parties and partying as form. And I got into cakes specifically because I was always really trying to find a way to work celebration and community and like kind of that togetherness in my work. I'm very, very, very into collaboration, and both my parents are immigrants, and I grew up having never gone to Haiti, having never gone to the Dominican Republic where they're from. And when we would have family come visit, I would kind of see them light up. And I grew up like in the American South, like Texas and Louisiana. And when they were sitting around the table, like sharing recipes, like sharing like food, it was, I don't know, it was like this, I was able to speak the language. And I think about, again, like my ancestry and like even like my trans ancestors and like my queer ancestors. I feel like the body remembers when I have like certain foods that like really like do trigger like a really good memory for me. I feel like it's kind of a way that I can kind of like create that bridge and feel that connection to the life ways of my ancestors through food. I think about like devastation a lot also, and the togetherness. A few years ago, I was like attacked. It was a hate crime, and all of my friends came together, and it was during quarantine, and it's so crazy how no matter like what happens like in this world, queer folks can really get together and somehow find a way to turn it into a party, to turn it into a celebration. It almost feels like a steel rod in place of a spine in that way. And I feel like with cakes, it does call upon partying. It does call upon togetherness and celebration. And yeah, I lost the question, but
No, you answered the question.
If I could piggyback off the idea of like cakes as celebration, like that's something that that's why I love cake so much, is because like it's the only food that will like make or break an event, right? Like a wedding is the cake, right? If someone drops the cake, like there goes the wedding kind of thing. Like a birthday cake is the cake, right? There's nothing else. You can't bring a meatloaf to a birthday party, right? And have that be the thing, right? And there's kind of like no reason why, right? Because it's like, but that's the thing. They're just like a means of like celebration. And like you're saying too, the idea of like, how do we find like being queer, living in this world for better or worse, like, and having to live in this space, like how do we just find our own joy? And like how do we define for ourselves, like regardless of what's happening outside, like what we want to celebrate and like what we find fun. And I think that's like what really draws me to cake then, is like, oh, okay, like, I've made more than a couple in my life, but every one is exciting because it's like, you imagine people, eating it and celebrating and really making that moment and thinking about it. And, you always see photos of when you're kids, the cakes you have, and that's really significant, I think. Or, if your parents had them, like seeing photos of your parents' wedding cakes, like these things like really, like the idea of like this like ancestral like tongue, right? This like flavor memory, I think is like totally where it's at for me,
I know you might have wanted to answer that question, but I have to jump in with a new question because what you're both talking about ancestry and memory and the way in which cakes can honor something or someone. And in many ways, what I ask you to do is create an homage to an artist, right? Like to make something that celebrates an artwork and the person that made the art. And so I'd love to hear any of you talk about the kind of relationship that you formed with the artist that made this piece of art. The only living artist is Allison Janae Hamilton. We actually don't know the artist that made the sarcophagus fragment. We know that, we do know the name of the artist who made the egg serving dish, but it sort of serves as a utilitarian object, and Louise Nevelson passed away. So I'm curious if any of you got into a space of relationship with the artist that you were inspired by.
So Louise Nevelson, was a very interesting artist, and I really, in particular, felt drawn to process, because she worked with found wood and, a lot of kind of just bringing these pieces together and almost like working with what you have, which I find to be really almost inspiring creatively, as a part of the creative process. And so when I was putting together my cake, I baked pretty much just one sheet and then cut out a couple shapes, and I was like, okay, the rest of the shapes that are there, I'll work with that. Like, kind of just using that improvisation, as a starting point, and these kind of different parameters that I thought were really, helpful. But I thought something that was super interesting of what she said, where she was like, some interview that I had listened to, she had mentioned that, if she really valued working with wood, she would have it look like wood. And she specifically chose to, paint it all black. And I really love the idea that, because obviously my style is not, traditional in any sense. And that's also how I feel about this art form, is that, if I wanted it to look like a cake, it could look like cake, but specifically going outside of those lines. So I really enjoyed hearing her talk about her work. I think that really, definitely made me feel closer to this person, and I could, relate to how she was creating.
Yeah, so in my piece, I was really attracted to the sense of care that was put into making something utilitarian, yes, but just a dish to serve eggs to a group of people, something so simple as an egg. The inside holds, I think, 6 eggs, very, nicely, and I thought that was special. I've said a thing about cakes that they already present themselves as special. But in my relationship to the artist, it was a production silver place, so there was probably many artists there who were part of the process of making this piece. And as we're all artists up here, and we all probably work in some degree of production and don't get named, I was thinking about the modern concept of a food serving dish, and that's why I included the clamshell to-go containers in my cake, just to highlight kind of how we serve and receive food today very commonly. And actually, when I was buying the clamshell containers, I found that the company that makes them is called Royal Imports. So there's probably some history there connected to British colonies all over the world, and we're still purchasing them. And honestly, I don't know where they're made. It'd probably be impossible to find out, but I just thought that was interesting, how we're still kind of extracting and resourcing things from other places and calling them British. So
Great. Thank you. I liked what you said, Alli, about, if she valued wood, she would have made it look like wood. And then you were sort of like, if I valued cake, I would make it look like cake. I'm curious about other people's reactions to that statement. Like, in what ways do you value cake? And in what ways is it just the medium you happened upon one day and you kept doing it? Yeah, I guess the question is sort of at the essence of like, how did you arrive as a cake artist?
But it's I I have classically trained in fine art. I have a background in sculpture, and so what had happened was I've been doing cake for 15 years, and so it was like peak Ace of Cake period, if you guys remember that. So like cakes that look like other things, and so I got a job at a cake shop because I was a sculptor, and so I would make cakes that looked like dogs or stadiums or sneakers or purses. But for me, it was like the cake aesthetic, like the buttercream swirls, which were definitely out of fashion in like 2010, that I was really drawn to. And also my practice overall as a sculptor, a lot of what I do is impermanent. So it's made of paper or made of dirt. It's things that are meant to dissolve and degrade, or like even things that are meant to rot, like carved foods and things like that. And so for me, cake is kind of like the complete package, right? Because it's like I can sculpt and like utilize and showcase my talent, but also like to not destroy it is to ruin it, right? Like I love people's response where they're like, "Oh, I can't stand to eat it." And it's like, well, if you don't eat it, you've ruined this. Like you've wasted all of everyone's time. Like you're supposed to destroy it, right? That's fun, right? I mean, I don't know. And I think too, it's also just, and to me, time is a big thing in the sense that I think about like history and stuff in like the thousands of years. And, people say things like, oh, paintings last forever, but that's not true. Like paintings become dust eventually, except for maybe ceramics, like nothing will last forever. And it's a conceptual place for me to come from as an artist. And so I personally would rather witness the creation and destruction of something like in my own life, especially when we live in this like highly mediated world where, we made these a couple hours ago and there's already photos of them on a screen in front of us. You know what I mean? It's like, it's almost like the object itself like has lost some value because like and not to say it's a bad thing, right? But that like the original kind of has less of a gravitas than it used to. And so sort of like pushing into that and having a lot of fun with that idea is where really I kind of came to cake.
I thought that was really interesting what you said about, seeing it in your own lifetime. I think about that a lot. I don't come from a traditional art background, and I actually studied anthropology in undergraduate. So I also, work in sculpture, but mostly have been working in ceramic, and as Edward mentioned, one of the most permanent materials. Yeah. So the idea, I just like couldn't get it out of my mind, like, working in production ceramics and just, creating like piece after piece of like, lamps or whatever I was making, and kind of like, oh my gosh, like I could not get the thought out of my mind of like, somebody's going to excavate this and like what, like why do we need more of this, Yeah. And so the like impermanence and like, making something that like there is an end point, like I don't feel haunted by it. It's not like accumulating dust or like laying dormant somewhere, that it's like, active. And so I feel like that's like a big part of why cake was interesting to me. And then just like the process of working with the ingredients and, a lot of the tools are almost kind of similar. And a lot of us work in ceramics too. And so we were talking about that in the kitchen as we were preparing these of like, these are literally the same things. So that was really, interesting and something that just stays in my mind while I work with cake. But something in particular, I would say, and something that I had noticed, particularly in the beginning when I started making these cakes, is that people really like expect a cake to look a certain way, and like people were almost like offended when it didn't like match what they like would anticipate a cake to look like. And as we were all talking about like really the meaning of the cake, you put so much meaning onto what this represents for you, or like what the purpose is, and whatever it is, it's always something big, right? Like it's always a big emotion or a big feeling. And so to kind of have that be something that like you also like visually like don't like some people were just like, no, like I don't like this, like this isn't a cake. But at the same time, it's like it still is a cake. You're gonna eat it, and you can literally have like your same celebration around it. And I just thought that was so interesting how like strongly people would like feel towards these like different forms of it, which felt really kind of mind blowing. People had like really strong feelings about it. It was like, why are you so mad? It's cake.
Yeah, why are they so mad? Billy or Magna, do you want to answer the coming to cake question?
Yeah. So I arrived to cake, I would say pretty early on. I started working at Magnolia Bakery just because I like was in school and needed a job. And I was like into icing already and like piping. I was really inspired by Yvette Moriega, who is an artist that works out of Chicago, who does like these acrylic works on canvas that look like cake. And it's such a like beautiful thing if you're like standing like distance away, but then when you get closer, you realize that it like touches on themes of like borderlands and immigration, and it's just these incredible works. For me, food has always been like a familial ancestral tie to me. I am no contact with a good majority of my family. As a result, it's been like an out queer person, and I come from like a deeply religious Caribbean family, and I was just trying to really figure out for myself like how I could be soothed by a bitter thing. The bitter thing for me being like my ancestral tie, like through food. And I started having these dinner parties with my friends weekly. And it was just kind of like playing around in the kitchen, wanting to do something fun. Then I just started doing these really like kooky looking like wild cakes. I also was like, I'm not really big into like super sweet cakes, and I really wanted to figure out how I can make cakes. Like I know you did a true savory cake, but I started like working with like native ingredients for me, which was like tamarind and coconut, which are ingredients that I like use for this cake. With a lot of Haitian foods, it's like lemon washed, so I always try to like incorporate that into my cakes as well, like coating things in lemon juice, like kind of like incorporating that into a major part of the cakes I make. But yeah, it was more so I feel like I was really like thrown the rope of love to be able to engage with cakes and like food in general in this way that felt really, really good, and that felt like a way that I could like then build upon community, then like create family through that and like connection.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Billy?
My turn now. Let's see. Whoops. Whoa. Well, let's see here. I came into cakes, the pandemic, that was really it for me. I started out the gate making these things. People had no other choice but to get a cake for me because everywhere else was closed. So, during the pandemic, I was working in a restaurant before the pandemic and making pastry there, and during the pandemic, I had this opportunity to help people celebrate in their tiny little worlds. And that felt special and important to me then. And because they had no choice, they went with whatever they got. And so I really felt the freedom to explore my own self-expression and give people something that they're never going to forget. And across my work, I like to play with ideas of decomposition, decomposing, like the fall of empire, the sense that something is teetering on collapse, and yet at the same time, there's elements that are rising out of that, and there's elements that are giving back, and that are exciting. So it's sort of like this line between celebration and mourning, like the fear and the excitement of the future. And so I like to try to make my cakes look like they're falling apart, but also they're standing very tall. And well, I came to cakes during the pandemic, yes.
Wow. Thank you. So now we have a few minutes for any questions from you all. I'm going to call on you, and then I'll hear your question. I'm going to repeat your question so everyone can hear it loudly and clearly, and then y'all can answer in whatever way makes sense. Okay, we got a question.
Great.
In terms of the 2010s and Ace of Cakes and some other things, and particularly the background of sculpture leading into cake. So the question is, fondant, glorious or evil?
Okay, the question is fondant, glorious or evil? And it relates to the 2010s explosion of cakes on TV and the cake boss, perhaps, okay?
Yeah, I love a controversial opinion. I actually think fondant is great, except not on cakes. Fondant, the filling of a Thin Mint, that's fondant. The frosting for donuts, that's fondant. Like, fondant is like, you can thin it, you can make it thicker. It has lots of places in the cake industry. Fondant itself really took off in the 80s. It was sort of seen as like this sort of like modern, sleek, clean thing, and then really kind of like stuck in for 30 or 40 years to the point that like the cakes I am like really known for doing are called Lambeth or like British overpiping, which is like a Victorian way of decorating, and it almost went fully extinct. There's just a few decorators in the world that still do it, and it's kind of for that reason because it all became fondant, and that has a lot to do with like the commerce of baking and the industry of baking. You can like make a fondant covered wedding cake in like a day. And when you're looking at high overhead, 5% margins, you know, it's some of the things that we actually all talked about in the kitchen. It's like, you know, we make cakes because we love making it. It's like not, at least for us, at least for the cakes that we make, it's not that viable of a business. You know, it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. People don't want to pay for it when they can go to the grocery store and get one for $5. And I'm not going to knock them for that, right? That just sort of is what it is. But this is just like the economy of the industry. But we're using fondant like sculpturally, I think is a lot of fun. To me, like those like hyper-realistic cakes, you know, there was another period of hyperrealism in food, and that was like in like the 16th and 17th century. And that's when you really had a lot of like what we now call desserts being invented, where they would go to like Versailles, and not only all the food on the table made of sugar, but so were the napkins, so were the plates, so was the table itself. And it was like a means of just kind of showing off power and wealth and prowess, you know? And I think that kind of mirrors a lot of that time in our country, right? Where we were kind of at this point of just like excessiveness, you know, just like, yes, it's a cake, but yes, it looks like a gym shoe sort of thing, you know? And that's like, and I think it's great. But I don't know, controversial opinion, you know what I mean?
No, I don't think it's that controversial. Yeah, fondant for me, I do not use it in my like actual cakes. I think another thing we did all talk about was that all of our cakes taste really good, and because we put a lot of like care and intention in that way. But I also do like to like survive capitalism and like work. I do a lot of like TV set work, and I've like done designs for Sims 4 game, RuPaul's Drag Race, and a show on Showtime, The Shy. When I do cakes, I use styrofoam, like actual is the inside, and I cover them in fondant, and I'm able to kind of just go in and manipulate it in the way that I want to. Really similar, I feel about food, like very similar to how like ceramicists feel about clay. I know that clay remembers. It remembers like what you did to it, what happens to it, and I feel that way when I'm like engaging with the cake. I want to like go in it with full intention, full love, like nothing but love. If I'm like giving it to someone to be used in times of celebration, if I'm using it for more of like commercial work, it's something to be like kind of further manipulated. It's kind of out of my hands. It's no longer mine. The one thing about like these cakes is when I make a cake as such, it is like, it can't be, like you said, it can't be recreated. And I think, yeah, I don't know if that's an argument against fondant or for it, but yeah, that's all I have to say about it.
Well,
Yeah.
Well, I think
As someone who
Billy's cake
uses-
has
my cake is covered in fondant, so I didn't always use fondant, but when I discovered it, I can't get enough of this stuff. All of the like drapery and special effects you see there are pretty much all fondant. To me, I know it's like a sore subject, but I think through all of art, there's these new mediums that come about, like acrylic paint or photography, and it disrupts the classical or the previous way of making something, and it's really up to the artist to use that and interpret it to their, to make their point or whatever. And my point is anything goes. So.
Up to you.
Yeah, I think fondant has a time and a place, and like Billy said, if that's what you're feeling, then go for it.
I've never tried it before. I'm gonna try it today.
And honestly, it's very fun.
All right, so I see a couple hands down here in the front. I'm wondering if maybe you could each ask your question, and then I could compile them into one question. What do you think? Okay. Okay.
How long does it take to make your cake?
Okay.
Do you ever watch baking shows and then be like, ha ha ha, they're so stupid?
Wow. Okay, so question, I'll go backwards. Question one, do you watch baking shows and laugh at them and say they're stupid? Question two, how long does it take to make one of these cakes? And question three, what's in your cake and what does it taste like?
Well, if I can jump in, I've been on some of those baking shows.
Edward is a reality TV star.
Well, I don't know about star, but I've been on a couple of shows, Food Network and Disney Plus, and they are like the most stressful thing you can possibly imagine. That's the thing, right? It's like one challenge I can talk about was I was on a cookie show, and they had us make 24 Christmas cookies, and we had 2 hours to do it. But then an hour in, they told us, hey, make another 24 totally different cookies also. And so we were really in a time crunch. That second set never aired, right? So it looked like we were just like buffoons, not knowing how to mix batter for 2 hours, right? And so that's the thing. It's like a lot of those reality shows, and it's, and on top of that, on TV it looks one way, but all those kitchen stations are 40 feet apart because there's a crew of 80 people running around. There's boom cameras, and there's usually one producer per baker, kind of so why are you mixing it that way right now, and stuff like that. And so they really try and make you look like a fool, because that's good TV, right? It's good advertising kind of thing. And so that's the thing. And so for a while, yes, I did feel that way. I'm like, wow, who can't make a cookie, sort of thing, But then after doing that show, is wow, this is they are being traumatized right now, and I am watching this happen, So I have a lot more empathy in my heart for the competitive bakers, I have to say.
So maybe you can start. How long did it take to make your cake, and what does it taste like?
So the cake itself is a whole wheat flour that's from upstate New York, with grass-fed butter from Wisconsin, and the eggs are also from New York. I love using local and, if I can, American ingredients. And then the flavor in the cake, I used a honey glaze that was a wild mountain honey, so it's sort of kind of like Mediterranean. And a glaze, I mean, when you make a cake, you will make a simple syrup. This is a pro tip. When you make a cake, you make a simple syrup, and then you sort of drench the cake as you stack it in the simple syrup, and that is what gives you that box mix, moist cake. You can't really bake that into a cake. And so I use honey in that. And then the exterior of mine is like a puff, like a Rice Krispie treat, but it's actually spelt and barley, which are old world grains. And I poached fresh bay leaves in the butter, which bay leaves, like I said, they're an aromatic, and they were used as a sweet ingredient in the Roman times. So I tried to add that little bit of flavor to it. And then in the royal icing, which is the white icing, it's cinnamon. And then the filling of my cake is a white fig and walnut. So tons of sweet flavors, not a lot of salt or anything else. But yeah, so mine is going to taste dare I say traditional, but not really quite so far out, but it should have a honey sort of flavor, some warm spices, a little bit of crunch from the walnut. And then this cake took, I don't know, 14, 16, 18 hours to make, I think. The panels I made over the last week, essentially. So, and you'll see it when you get up there. They're covered in figures. Royal icing dries hard, and so I had the ability to take a lot of time and make that. And then the cake itself, 3-4 hours to stack a cake, something like that, right? You know, and then we worked here on site for at least 8 or 9 hours. God, so maybe it was like a 15 or 20 hour cake. Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, but yeah, so it took a while. Yeah.
Maybe a whole entire day.
Yeah.
A whole entire day. Magnet.
What was the first question?
The first question is, do you laugh at the reality TV people?
No, I don't laugh. Yeah, I too have done a baking show. It is not easy. It might have been a little more easier than yours. Like, I brought a fully done cake onto set, and then when the cake was done, it was like literally iced. I pulled it out of the oven, and it was just like, hey, here's the cake. Yeah, it was a lot of waiting around. It was really hot, really sweaty. I was having to like read from a teleprompter. So that was really hard. They wrote a script for me, and that was really funny. I feel like I can't say, but if you look it up, you can probably easily find it. Like the show I did, but I did not have the best experience doing that. I just kind of showed up, worked, got paid, went home. But no, I wouldn't laugh. It's like, it's hard. It's hard. I would hate to be a PA. Does it taste good? You have to come find me and tell me. If you like hate it, tell me. I'm here for all forms of criticism. It's a tea cake. I really love milk tea. It's just like a personal big love of mine. I have like no real tie to it besides like, wow, I love milk tea. And then I started making milk tea cakes. And I've kind of been doing that for the past 2 years. Anytime I have an opportunity to make a milk tea cake, I will be making a milk tea cake. So I did a lemon chamomile milk tea cake. Yeah, and I just like soak tea leaves and make the milk tea base. And I always do like a basic, I have like one recipe that I use all the time for every single cake that I do. I will add things to it to give it whatever kind of flavor I want. I make a lot of simple syrups as well. And I just, again, add that in it. And that's where the flavor comes from with the milk tea cake, where like any cake recipe calls for like milk. I just put my milk tea in. So that was it. If you hate it, tell me. If you love it, also tell me. I love compliments. And what was the
How
other
long
question?
did it take?
Yeah, like, I've made cakes within like, okay, so I work at an artist residency in Michigan, and we have like Friday night open studios a few months out of the year, or a few months out of the year. We probably have it like 4 times a year, and we open up the whole campus. It's called Oxbow, to like come in and like, you know, see our studios and see what we're working on. I was asked I thought they were in the room, but I think Kelly left. The person who runs the kitchen at Oxbow at 1 p.m. to make a cake for the auction that was at 6 p.m. and was like, make it tall, make it layered. We're going to feature it in the auction. So I've had to make a cake within like 2-hour time frames. And also like I've had as long as like 3 days a week. When people book cakes with me, I try to ask for like a week advance. So yeah, I like to spend a lot of time with them. All the flours that I put in all of my cakes, which is almost every single cake I make, they're all completely edible. I really, really, really am interested in like dirt we can eat and like plants we can eat and things we can just like forage and take. But yeah, so you can eat every part of this cake. You know,
Magna, do I remember correctly? You told me you wash every petal of the flower?
That's a lie. Yeah, I'm so sorry. That was like, it must have come to you in a dream. I actually don't wash anything. I literally always have like a little pair of tweezers, scissors, kitchen shears, and I will like be cutting things from the fronts of people's like homes and lawns. But yeah, I don't. I'm sorry.
Get this away from me. Yeah.
Can't wait to taste that. The best reality baking show is called Nailed It. Yeah. Okay. That is a huge inspiration. You laugh, you cry, okay? The designs are incredible. Every cake is beautiful. So very inspiring show. I would love to be on it. And My cake is a gluten-free chocolate espresso cake with a lime soak, like Edward was talking about. Keep it moist. And Swiss meringue buttercream and a passion fruit custard. Since we're talking about these reality shows, I'll give you a little challenge. I forgot an ingredient and left it out, so maybe you can find which ingredient is missing. It definitely makes things very tart when it's left out, so you can see if you can find out what it is. And if you can find it out, I'll give you a present. My flavors are inspired from the Global South, Brazilian flavors, so it's just kind of reminders of where all this stuff comes from. And a cake, when I'm working alone, cake takes me weeks. I'm very, very slow. I like to do one thing a day and just take my time. I have a big freezer. Today it took me, let's see, we started at 4 o'clock and I went till 1 o'clock today.
Yes.
We started yesterday at 4 o'clock and I ended at 1 o'clock today, so what's that, 72 hours?
Yeah, a long time. Really long.
Yeah, that's probably the fastest I've ever put a cake together, so I'm proud of myself. So.
I'm proud of you too.
Yeah. Thank you.
Alli?
Okay, well, I definitely nailed it. I'm obsessed with that show. But otherwise, I feel like more so, I like watch these and I'm like, oh, that's a really good idea. Like just, yeah, I feel like people, and that was an incredible thing about working together is just like the things that people do and know and just like sharing knowledge is really fun. But yeah, the cake process definitely takes a really long time. And especially, trying to work it into daily life so that I'm not doing that at all times. So it's like you do it in parts. The freezer is your best friend. And so you can, prepare things over weeks or, save things. So my cake is the main cake is a banana layer cake, which I arrived on because I had some bananas that were overripe and also felt like that was very Louise Nevelson, my found materials, because found materials in cake aren't really a thing. But saving bananas from going bad is a thing. So that's how I started with that. And then, kept it over in the freezer over time. And then kind of built from there. So it has a date lime caramel filling, and then the buttercream, it's a lime Swiss meringue buttercream. And then the other components, I have a sunflower seed decoise, which is usually made with nuts, but we went with sunflower seeds, and a Thai tea buttercream, Thai tea being one of my favorite afternoon pick-me-ups as like a little caffeine treat, so I always have some Thai tea in my house. And let's see, what else? We
Cheesecake?
have coconut cheesecake with some toasted coconut. And yeah, I think that's mostly it. So tastes pretty interesting mix of like fruity and, a little tropical. But I would say you would be surprised. It's like, I know a date lime caramel can sound kind of crazy, but most of it tastes like a deep caramel that's like a little tangy. Yeah.
It's really good.
Wow. So thank you all for this. It's really amazing to hear you talk about about your cakes, but also about your experience here and talking to each other in the kitchen and getting to know one another in person, where some of you have met online. I want to say that this project for me was about a creative solution to talking about artwork in our permanent collection. And in some ways, it's like it started there with these 4 pieces of art, and then it brought us to this beautiful conversation about, ancestry, community, queerness, cake decorating, reality TV shows. and to me, that's what's so important about art museums and art education, is thinking about ways that we can enter artwork, historic or contemporary, through things that we already know about and already care about. So thank you for going on this journey with us, and really leading us on the journey. So now we're going to go upstairs to the rotunda, and you're all going to get to try these cakes. As you can see, there's many of you, so the portions are going to be quite small, but you'll get to try each one. There's also iced coffee and iced tea and Prosecco for those of you who are of age to drink Prosecco. And so they told us a little bit about the ingredients, but the full ingredient lists are listed next to the cake on the table, but it also exists on a sign that's in front of the artwork. So now is your chance to go upstairs, see the artworks that are here up in our galleries, look at the cakes in the round before we have a ceremonial cake slicing moment, and we break open the cakes and you eat them. Anything I'm missing? Yeah, when we're up there, we're going to try to get into 2 lines, and I'll tell you more about that when we get upstairs. So thank you for being here.